In 1969, a motorcycle rolled off a Japanese assembly line that would help bury an entire industry. It had 4 cylinders, a disc brake, an electric starter, and a price tag that made British executives choke on their tea. The Honda CB754 could do 125 miles per hour and cost $1,495. A Harley-Davidson Electroglide ran about $1,900, and fully loaded touring bikes sold for well over $3,000. The CB750 undercut all of them while outperforming most. That was 1969. By the mid-1970s, the British motorcycle industry as a global force was effectively finished. An empire that had ruled the world for half a century collapsed in barely a decade. So how did 4 companies from Japan manage to dismantle an empire that had been building motorcycles since the Victorian era? If you had asked anyone in the British motorcycle industry around 1955 whether Japanese bikes were a threat, they would have laughed at you. And honestly, you could not blame them. Britain was sitting on top of the world. The Birmingham Small Arms Company, better known as BSA, was the largest motorcycle manufacturer on the planet. Their marketing slogan was "1 in 4 is a BSA," and it was not much of an exaggeration. BSA had absorbed Triumph back in 1951, along with Ariel, Sunbeam, and New Hudson, and together this group controlled roughly a quarter of global motorcycle production. In 1967, and again in 1968, BSA Triumph won the Queen's Award to Industry for Exports. These bikes were not just machines, they were national treasures. The Triumph Speed Twin, the BSA Gold Star, the Norton Dominator. These were the bikes that won races, patrolled highways, and defined what a motorcycle was supposed to be. The European competition was not even close. Italy's brands had racing pedigree but far smaller industrial scale. Moto Guzzi had won 5 straight 350 cubic centimeter world championships from 1953 to 1957, but then withdrew from Grand Prix racing alongside Gilera and Mondial. Ducati was still a small, racing-oriented firm in Bologna. BMW's Boxer twins from Munich were respected, but already in trouble. BMW motorcycle production crashed from 30,000 units in 1954 to fewer than 5,500 by 1957, and 3 of its biggest German competitors went out of business in 1967. Cheap small cars like the Austin Mini and the Volkswagen Beetle were stealing customers who used to ride motorcycles with sidecars to get the family around. The British looked at all of this and felt pretty comfortable. That comfort was a warning sign. They ignored it. Meanwhile, in a factory in Hamamatsu, Japan, a man named Soichiro Honda was building something nobody in Birmingham was paying attention to. Honda and his business partner Takeo Fujisawa launched the C100 Super Cub in 1958. It was a tiny thing, a 50 cubic centimeter step-through with a pressed steel frame, leg shields, and a tough little overhead valve 4-stroke engine. The design came from a 1956 trip to Europe, where Honda and Fujisawa watched mopeds swarming through German and Italian streets and decided they could do it better. American Honda Motor Company was incorporated in Los Angeles in June 1959 with 8 employees and $250,000 in capital. Their first shipments included larger Dream and Bentley machines aimed at traditional motorcycle buyers. Those bigger bikes were a disaster. Engine seizures, clutch failures, oil leaks. Warranty claims nearly killed the company in 1960 as broken bikes were air freighted back to Tokyo. The Super Cub, though, found a completely different audience almost by accident. California outdoorsmen threw them in the backs of pickup trucks. University students rode them to class. Suburban housewives used them for errands. Total American motorcycle imports in 1959 had been around 6,300 units. By the end of 1963, total U.S. motorcycle sales had exploded to roughly 148,000 units, and Honda was driving most of that growth. The decisive marketing move came in June 1963, when Gray Advertising launched one of the most successful campaigns in advertising history. You meet the nicest people on a Honda. The ads ran in Life magazine, Time, Look, and the Saturday Evening Post, and critically, in women's magazines too. They showed clean-cut students, mothers, and businessmen riding cheerful red and white Super Cubs that cost $295 at retail. This was a deliberate counter-image to the leather-clad biker menace that Marlon Brando had popularized in The Wild One. The campaign worked so well that the Beach Boys released a song called Little Honda in 1964. By that year, Honda commanded more than half of all U.S. motorcycle sales. Sales of the Super Cub in the U.S. went from 17,000 in 1961 to 35,000 in 1962 to 90,000 in 1963. American Honda's president Soichiro Kawashima sometimes drove the delivery trucks himself just to keep up with demand. The Super Cub went on to become the best-selling motorized two-wheeler in history, passing 60 million units by 2008 and 100 million by 2017. And it did not just sell motorcycles, it expanded the entire market. Kawashima put it perfectly, "Fine, we'll make the pie bigger on our own." Now, you'd think someone in Britain would have noticed all of this happening, and someone did. In 1960, Triumph's chief designer Edward Turner flew to Japan to assess the Japanese threat in person. Turner was brilliant. He had created the legendary 1937 Speed Twin that basically defined the modern British motorcycle. He came back from Japan with a report that should have set off alarm bells across the entire industry. Japanese manufacturers were already producing about 500,000 motorcycles per year against Britain's roughly 140,000. Honda alone was outproducing the entire British industry. Massive investment was pouring into new factories, automated tooling, and engineering talent. Turner's report contained everything British executives needed to hear, but then he added one sentence that sealed their fate. He wrote that he personally did not believe the Japanese motorcycle industry would eclipse the traditional type of machine that the British motorcyclist wanted and bought. In December 1965, he repeated the comfortable prediction that small Japanese bikes would simply create new riders who would eventually graduate to buying a Triumph or a BSA. It was the most expensive miscalculation in motorcycle history. Turner's deputy, a designer named Bert Hopwood, was screaming the opposite inside both BSA and Triumph. Hopwood had designed the Norton Dominator and the BSA A10. As early as 1943, he had proposed a transverse inline 4 Triumph. Throughout the 1960s, he kept pushing for modular engine families, a common architecture that could scale from a 200 cubic centimeter single up to an 800 cubic centimeter 4. He was overruled every single time. The answer to almost every modernization proposal, as Hopwood later wrote bitterly, was, "But they're still selling well, old boy." This decision seemed small at the time. It wasn't. While BSA's executives were congratulating themselves, the factories themselves were falling apart. Bikes were essentially handmade on pre-war machine tools. Quality control barely existed. Vibration problems, oil leaks, and Lucas electrical failures became their own running jokes in the motorcycle world. Lucas, the Prince of Darkness, was not a compliment. And instead of investing in motorcycle engineering, BSA poured money into the Ariel 3, a three-wheeled moped that lost 2 million pounds, and into car bodies, tools, and steel production. Anything except the motorcycles that were actually paying the bills. And then came the motorcycle that ended the argument forever. Honda first showed the CB754 in prototype form at the Tokyo Motor Show in October 1968. By early 1969, it was touring US dealer shows, and in April it reached British showrooms. It was the first mass-production motorcycle to feature a front hydraulic disc brake, paired with an inline 4-cylinder engine making 67 horsepower, 4 carburetors, a 4x4 exhaust, a 5-speed gearbox, and an electric starter. The CB750 could do 125 miles per hour. When American Honda's president Kawashima announced the price at a Las Vegas dealer meeting, $1,495, the room erupted in applause. Honda had originally planned to build 1,500 units per year. Demand was so far beyond expectations that production ramped to 1,500 and then 3,000 per month. The first, roughly 7,400 engines, had to be sandcast because Honda could not commit to die-cast tooling fast enough. The original single overhead cam CB750 was produced through 1978, with the nameplate continuing for decades and total sales exceeding 400,000 units. In March 1970, Dick Mann won the Daytona 200 on a CB750-based CR750, the symbolic moment Japan took the top step of America's most prestigious motorcycle race. Britain's response was the BSA Rocket 3 and the Triumph Trident. The same engine in 2 different frames was released as 2 near-identical models assembled at different factories to satisfy internal corporate politics, which, looking back, was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid. The Trident was actually a decent motorcycle, but it had been rushed to production with inadequate testing. It lacked a disc brake, lacked an electric starter, leaked oil, and Cycle World magazine tested both side by side and concluded the CB750 had 15% more power at roughly the same weight with far better refinement. Riders voted with their wallets. Honda was not alone for long. Kawasaki had been secretly developing its own inline four under the codename New York Steak because the internal project goal was to eat Honda's lunch in America. When Honda unveiled the CB750, the Kawasaki engineering team led by Gyoichi Inamura was stunned. They scrapped the 750 cubic centimeter prototype and went bigger. 903 cubic centimeters, twin overhead cams versus Honda's single overhead cam, and 82 horsepower. Designer Norimasa Tada drew the iconic teardrop tank and ducktail seat in 1 month flat. After a clandestine 1972 US test ride where they disguised the prototype in Honda bodywork and badges, the Kawasaki Z1900 launched at the September 1972 Cologne show as a 1973 model at $1,895. Top speed was 130 miles per hour, breaking a record that had stood since Vincent's Black Shadow in 1948. The Z11 MCN Machine of the Year 4 years running from 1973 through 1976, and roughly 85,000 sold in the first few years of production. Yamaha came in with the XS1, later called the XS650, in 1970. It was a 653 cubic centimeter parallel twin, a Japanese take on the classic British twin formula, but cleaner, tighter, and more reliable. Electric starter from 1971. Around 500,000 were produced through 1983. Suzuki completed the set with the GS750 in late 1976, a twin-cam 4 that testers immediately called the best-handling Japanese big bike of its era. All 4 Japanese manufacturers now had competitive machines across every displacement class. The universal Japanese motorcycle was born. The production gap tells the real story. By the mid-1970s, total British motorcycle output had collapsed to the tens of thousands per year. Honda alone was producing millions of motorcycles annually. If you are enjoying this deep dive into motorcycle history, hit subscribe. We cover stories like this every week. So here is where the dominoes started falling, and they fell fast. In 1971, BSA Group posted a £3 million trading loss. Barclays Bank put up £10 million for a rescue, but 13 revised models planned for 1972 missed their production dates. By March 1973, BSA shares had collapsed, and 300 workers at the Meriden Triumph factory were laid off. Prime Minister Edward Heath's government stepped in with a £4.87 million bailout on the condition that the entire mess be consolidated. BSA Triumph's motorcycle operations were absorbed into Norton Villiers, itself the remains of the bankrupt AMC Group, creating a new entity called Norton Villiers Triumph, or NVT, in July 1973. NVT chairman Dennis Poor inherited 4 plants and immediately announced that Meriden, Triumph's home factory in Coventry, would close. On September 14, 1973, about 1,700 workers, organized by the engineering union, occupied the factory. They held it for 18 months, not days, not weeks. 18 months. They blocked parts shipments that paralyzed the Small Heath BSA plant too. Triumph Bonneville production essentially stopped at the worst possible moment, right as the 1973 oil crisis was driving motorcycle demand higher than ever. People wanted cheap transportation. Britain could not build it. Harold Wilson's Labour government eventually funded a worker cooperative at Meriden in March 1975 with roughly £4.95 million. About 200 workers bought the plant and started building Bonnevilles again. They produced the bikes in dwindling numbers until the cooperative collapsed in 1983. Meanwhile, the British government had commissioned the Boston Consulting Group to analyze the industry. The Boston Consulting Group report, published in July 1975, became one of the most famous strategy documents in business history. Its conclusions were brutal. British managers had pursued short-term profits through what the Boston Consulting Group called segment retreat, abandoning the small bike market to Japan while believing their profitable big bike segment could be defended forever. It could not. Without volume, costs could never come down. Without low costs, no competitive position was defensible. The Boston Consulting Group offered 3 options: a low-volume, premium specialist at 15,000 to 20,000 units per year, a BMW-style intermediate player, or a full-scale modernization at 70,000 units per year, which would require over £50 million in public funding. The government's Industrial Development Advisory Board looked at all three options and concluded that none of them were viable. The British motorcycle industry, as an industry, was finished. Andover closed. Wolverhampton closed. Small Heath shipped its final bikes, a Saudi police order of Tridents, in February 1976. NVT was liquidated in 1978. The list of dead brands was staggering. AJS, Matchless, Ariel, Sunbeam, James, Francis Barnett, BSA, Royal Enfield, Velocette, Vincent, all gone. Now here's what makes this story even more interesting. Not every European brand died. A few survived, and the way they did it explains everything about what actually went wrong for the British. BMW made a deliberate strategic decision in 1969 to keep its motorcycle division alive as a premium halo brand, a prestige companion to the new 2002 sports sedan. They hired Hans-Günther von der Marwitz from Porsche to design the 5 Series, the first true airhead boxer twins. The R55, R65, and R75-5 models launched for the 1970 model year from a new factory in Berlin's Spandau district with 12-volt electrics, electric starters, and modern frames. By building premium, low-volume, high-quality machines, BMW occupied a premium touring niche where Japanese mass production advantages mattered less. Moto Guzzi had been rescued by the Italian government in 1967 and bet everything on Giulio Cesare Carcano's Transverse 5 twin engine, originally designed to win a 1965 Italian police motorcycle contract. The 1971 V7 Sport, designed by Lino Tonti, and especially the 1976 850 Le Mans, gave Guzzi a design signature so unique that no Japanese manufacturer even tried to copy it. Longitudinal crankshaft, shaft drive, that distinctive V-twin character. Nothing else on the road felt like a Guzzi. Ducati played the same game from a different angle. Engineer Fabio Taglioni's Desmodromic L twin engine became the foundation. When Paul Smart won the 1972 Imola 200 on a Ducati 750, it led directly to the 1973 Green Frame 750 SS and the legendary 900 SS. Racing success and radical engineering gave Ducati an identity that transcended volume manufacturing. Most European brands that survived did so by being deliberately uncompromisingly different. They did not try to outproduce Hamamatsu. They carved out niches where mass production was not the advantage. The British tried to compete on volume and lost. That was the fundamental error. Underneath all the corporate drama and government bailouts, there was a deeper clash that made the outcome almost inevitable. The Japanese practiced Kaizen, continuous improvement driven by statistical quality control, short development cycles, and capital-intensive automated production. A lot of this came from W. Edwards Deming, the American statistician who lectured in post-war Japan, and whose ideas about quality management were, ironically, largely ignored in the West. Honda iterated the CB750 continuously between 1969 and 1970, acting on dealer feedback within months. Component tolerances were tighter. Oil tightness was a design requirement rather than a pleasant surprise, and features like electric starters and disc brakes were treated as basic expectations rather than luxury additions. British factories were craft workshops that had been scaled up without actually modernizing. Bikes were hand-fettled on aging machine tools. Many parts were not interchangeable between supposedly identical machines off the same production line. Engineering changes moved at glacial speed, and the labor relations, while not the root cause that British management liked to blame, certainly accelerated the decline. The Meriden sit-in was the most dramatic example, but strikes and disputes plagued the entire industry throughout the late 1960s and early 1970s. U.S. motorcycle registrations, which had stood at roughly 45,000 in 1960, passed 1 million by 1970, and climbed toward 5 million by the mid-1970s, counting everything from street bikes to mopeds and mini bikes. The overwhelming majority were Japanese. The Japanese had not beaten the British by taking their customers. They had built an entirely new market that the British refused to see. Honda's original US sales target in 1959 was 10% of an estimated 550,000 unit market with 5% annual growth. By the mid-1970s, the American two-wheeler market had exploded far beyond anything British executives in 1960 thought possible, and Honda owned the biggest slice. Edward Turner's prediction that small Japanese bikes would simply feed customers up to British big bikes turned out to be partially right. Those customers did want to graduate to bigger machines. But having experienced reliability, electric starters, and engines that did not leave puddles on the garage floor, they graduated to bigger Japanese bikes. They never came back. The name Triumph was eventually rescued by property developer John Bloor, who bought the rights and relaunched modern Triumphs from a brand new factory in Hinckley, Leicestershire in 1990. Today's Triumph is a thriving company, but it is a completely different business built from scratch, not a continuation of the old Meriden operation. Turner once told the industry they had nothing to worry about. That was 1960. By 1976, the only British motorcycle you could buy was a hand-built Bonneville, assembled by a worker cooperative that would go broke in 7 years. That is the strangest, fastest industrial death of the 20th century. If this story hooked you, you will want to see our breakdown of how one Japanese motorcycle company went from building pianos to producing the fastest bikes on the planet. That video is on screen now. Click it. You will not be disappointed.